Welcome everyone to our sixth seminar for our Frailty Seminar Series. I'm Olga Theo. I'm a frailty researcher from Dalhousie University in Canada, and I will be the moderator for today's session. Today, I have the great privilege to introduce a very well-established frailty researcher, Dr. Karen Bandeen-Ross. Dr. Bandeen-Ross is a gerontologist and statistician, and currently is the Frank Harley and Catherine Dorier Professor and Chair of Biostatistics at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Her gerontological research, spanning 30 years, aimed to understand the causes and course of physical disability, cognitive decline, and frailty in older adults, so that the adverse implications can be delayed or avoided. Her statistical research is in latent variable and multivariate outcome modeling and its application to improve measurement and characterize the validity of geriatric outcomes. She has disseminated her work in both areas through more than 200 publications. Dr. Bandeen-Ross has worked to establish several aging-focused programs, including the Johns Hopkins Training Program on the Epidemiology and Biostatistics of Aging and the Johns Hopkins Older Americans Independent Center focused on frailty. She has led the statistical design and its implementation for multiple epidemiological studies on aging. Most recently, she's pursuing research to characterize resilience in older adults as one of the principal investigators for the SPRING trial. Overall, she seeks to better the lives of older adults through research and the interface of basic quantitative population and clinical science. Dr. Bandeen-Ross will present today on progression of physical frailty and the risk of all-cause mortality. She will present for approximately 40 minutes, and we will then have approximately 20 minutes for discussion. During the presentation, please add your questions to the Q&A tab you'll find most likely at the bottom of your screen. Please only use the chat if you have technical issues or something to share with the panelists, but for your questions and comments, use the Q&A. I would now like to invite our presenter to share the screen and start the presentation. Thank you.
Olga, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I'm really thrilled to be a part of this series. This has really been a wonderful contribution to the field, and really look forward to the future talks as well. Thanks especially to Sarah Espinoza, who invited me and who suggested the topic that I'll be talking with you about today. I honestly didn't know how relevant it would become, and that leads to a dedication. I'd like to dedicate this talk to my mother and to my mother-in-law. September of last year, they both were frail, 92, but hanging in there. Less than 2 months later, they both had passed away. And so they really exemplify the things that we're going to talk about today. I think I'll just leave it as a dedication, maybe with a comment here and there, but it also gives me the opportunity to just appreciate our field. It's really a privilege to be a part of our field of gerontology dedicated to the betterment of older adults, particularly coming from a field like statistics. Here's the outline for my talk. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the conceptual case for the relationship between physical frailty and all-cause mortality. That is background, I believe, is really crucial in order to understand the rest of the talk. I will emphasize here I'll be limiting my discussion to physical frailty, but I think that the same issues pertain for other models of frailty, and likewise, their conceptual underpinnings have very interesting implications for how and the patterns in which all-cause mortality arise. Number two is the meat of the talk, the actual evidence having to do with specific work on the progression of frailty and mortality. If there's time, I'll briefly talk about 3 practical implications or considerations. And if there's not time, that's material that we can easily either rush past or skip, and then conclude with a little bit of discussion. So let's begin with the conceptual case for that association between physical frailty and all-cause mortality by considering what is physical frailty. And I believe strongly that to really understand physical frailty, one needs to understand a specific hypothesis as to its etiology, which that the arising of the frailty phenotype reflects dysregulation in a key set of dynamic physiological systems. So here is a schematic from a recent paper that I was privileged to co-publish with others. At the top, you can see the physical frailty phenotype, which many, if not all of us know. 5 criteria of slow gait, low activity, fatigue, weight loss, and weakness. 3 out of 5 of those constitute having frailty according to the frailty phenotype. 1 or 2 pre-frailty, and then 0 is robust. That's a clinical manifestation whose definition was driven by clinical observation of frail older adults by many geriatricians and gerontologists. The hypothesis is shown really in this part of the slide where my cursor is bracketing. And so we've long hypothesized that frailty, at least physical frailty, arises due to the progressive dysregulation of key physiological systems, primarily that have to do with governing stress response, as well as energy production, having implications for musculoskeletal features. And so one can imagine that those systems, both in their modules and in the way that they interact with each other, comprise what in engineering and mathematics we call a dynamical system. And a feature of dynamical systems is that changes may be nonlinear. So as these systems become dysregulated, what happens at the phenotypic level can be sudden, it can be unexpected, and I'm going to go more into that in a minute. The reference for this bit that I've been speaking about, I've just animated in at the bottom. I really wanted to do this not only to show all of the authors of this paper that was so much fun to write, but really to highlight this beautiful analogy that I have to credit to Ravi Varadhan, who came up with this phrase of the transition from a homeostatic symphony to cacophony. And that absolutely is one way we think about the dysregulation of these systems leading to frailty. My brother and I, after the fact, in talking about our mother, found ourselves talking about the unraveling of physiology. And I think that's really an apt analogy. So if physical frailty is the outgrowth of a failing dynamical system, there are features of dynamical systems that we would hypothesize might come to play and that in turn would have implications for risk for all-cause mortality. So I'm going to highlight 3 of them. One is sort of a converse, and that's robustness or resilience. So a system is robust if it's able to withstand, resilient if it's able to recover from a stressor that's large enough that the whole system gets pushed into a state far from its original equilibrium state, but it ultimately retains or regains its essential identity and function. And so we could have a lovely conversation over whether frailty is the flip side of that, but we believe at least it's highly connected. And so you could think of frailty as a system losing its ability to withstand and recover even from minor stresses, such that the essential identity and function of the system is lost. Then there's the concept of emergence. And so dynamical systems often exhibit the occurrence of new and really unexpected phenomena. And typically these occur at a higher spatial or temporal scale than the scale at which the components are interacting. And so in our case, that would be the phenotypic presentation at the larger scale arising from the physiological dysregulation at the more cellular level. And then finally, there's the idea of critical transition, which is a specific type of emergent property. Specifically, it's a sharp or an abrupt change in the state of a system that can be hard to predict because it happens when the control settings change minimally. So a day-to-day example that we frequently see is the transition of water from liquid to solid. When we pass from below freezing to above freezing temperature. But this is the idea that the physiological system could unravel into a dramatically different state than it was than just previously before. And this, incidentally, is one reason that we tend to think of physical frailty in terms of states rather than a continuum. Okay, so what about the implications of all of this for mortality? Well, first of all, one would maybe hypothesize that, due to the possibility of a critical transition, there exists a threshold of systemic dysfunction beyond which there arises severe vulnerability to dissolution of the system upon subjection to stressors. You can imagine that this word severe either has to do with, vulnerability to even common stressors or very minor stressors. Those things happen more often, and so we could expect to see the risk of death arise steeply once that happens. Also, this might predict soon mortality after passing such a threshold. Now, below this threshold, one might still hypothesize increasing susceptibility to, more considerable stressors. That's an elevated but somewhat lower risk of mortality, or perhaps implications for longer-term mortality with lesser levels of frailty portending more severe ones coming in the future. And I sort of wish I had brought one more diagram, but sometimes I think of the state of regulation of systems as sort of gradually declining as frailty increases, or maybe going from one state to a slightly lower state to a slightly lower state, and then at the critical transition really falling off a cliff. All right, so that's the conceptual introduction. Now I'd like to go into the heart of the talk, which is the study of the relationship between all-cause mortality and the progression of physical frailty, but really coming from this lens of the idea of a potential critical transition after which the risk is greatly magnified. I put this one slide here in terms of the evidence base for cross-sectional associations between frailty at a point in time and mortalities. Again, speaking specifically of physical frailty, it's such an abundant literature, I'm not even going to try to summarize it. This is one example of a review paper that does a good job of summarizing the literature. Basically, I would hypothesize or say that almost any frailty measure has to satisfy this criterion. If it's not associated with mortality somehow, it's failed a basic test of validity. Now, what about going beyond cross-sectional to the study of progression of frailty and mortality? And there is some literature on that. I will give a brief, just slide showing some key papers later. But in my view, the evidence base progressively is surprisingly thin. And I think it's an area where, there's plenty of work yet to be done. My main focus today is on a specific paper, that is tied to the title of this talk. I think that this is what Sarah had in mind when she invited me to give this presentation. It's a paper that was led by my good colleague, Chen-Li Xu. I have to really credit him for, the deep conceptualization and the passion to drive this work forward. Can't tell you how many hours of conversation I enjoyed with him over it as, we worked on the paper. It turns out to be quite challenging to study, and I would love to have your insights on, areas where you think that further work can be done or refined. And so I'm really going to focus on this, not so much from the point of no return part of the title, but really the dynamical systems intro that I just gave. Two specific hypotheses then. One really has to do with this idea of a critical transition, that there exists a threshold relationship between the number of frailty manifestations and mortality risk. Just a brief aside, reviewers of the paper understandably really pushed us of what do you mean by a threshold relationship? And so what we finally settled on was this idea of a discontinuity in the first derivative. So stat jargon, whatever, some of you, will say, what is she talking about? It's basically this picture. So there's an example of a relationship that has a discontinuity in the first derivative is shown by a very abrupt change in the strength of the relationship by, say, progressive physiological dysregulation and mortality. And so, of course, in our study, the number of frailty criteria is a hypothesized proxy for this idea of increased physiological dysregulation. Second hypothesis is sort of a more general view on dynamics, that the strength of the association has to do with the rate and type of accumulation of frailty criteria. And so you'll see that one of these alternate lenses is sort of an alternate view on critical transition, and the other one is a more general way, a little bit more agnostic way of thinking about emergence. This study used a wonderful data set, the National Health and Aging Trends Study. And on the previous slide, I really should have pointed out Judy Casper as one of our co-authors. I really want to uplift her too, as we remember her following her extremely sad demise last summer. But she's left an incredible legacy in this data set, designed to be representative of the US older adult population. As an aside, methodologically, that means that we incorporate probability weights in the analysis that I'm about to show you. Round one was in 2011. We are using data spanning 2011 to 2018, so that's 7 years potentially of follow-up. And our analytic sample is 2,500, slightly more, robust older adults. That means older adults beginning without any physical frailty criteria, living in the community, or it could be assisted living residential setting in 2011, and you had at least one follow-up so that there's an opportunity to study progression in some form. So the statistical analysis briefly, our outcome, all-cause mortality over those 7 years. First thing that I'm going to show you is just some graphical displays by the frailty count milestone reached. This will be a lot easier to explain when I actually get to the displays. So I will do that there. But these are depicting both crude mortality rate in terms of frailty as frailty criterion count, as well as age-adjusted Kaplan-Meier survival curves, again, by this frailty count milestone that I'll describe in a minute. Then we'll show you some time-varying Cox models that are covariate adjusted analyses of mortality through 3 different lenses. Just the number of frailty criteria at any point in time, so that can go up or down as the time-varying analysis is proceeding. Different patterns of change, again, I'll explain that in more detail when we get there. And then gradual versus catastrophic frailty emergence. And certainly some of you will say, hey, that sounds like a classic article. And indeed, it is inspired by this wonderful classic article about progressive versus catastrophic disability emergence that Luigi Ferrucci, Jack Ralnick, and others published quite a while ago now. And then very briefly, there are the adjustments, not to linger on, but just so that you can see what we did adjust for in the models. Okay, so moving on to the results. Here's the 2 displays. The first of the 2 displays is the mortality rate by the number of criteria reached. And so crude mortality rate per 100 person years is on the y-axis. And now in terms of the frailty milestone reached, 0 denotes people who actually never developed frailty, meaning frank frailty. Actually, no, in this one, it's no criteria at all. So people who never developed any frailty criteria are in the bin labeled 0. then imagine, somebody develops one criterion for the first time. So that starts the clock for them at the next piece on the x-axis. And so upon reaching one criterion, there's a mortality rate shown there, and so on and so forth. The next one, upon reaching two criteria, what's the mortality rate starting there and, among all of those people. And so these are not mutually exclusive people across any of these bins except in the 0 bin. And so what you can see is, of course, one really expected thing, that the mortality rate increases every time one crosses that increased number of criteria threshold. But you can also see how dramatically it increases upon reaching 5 criteria. Now, the red bars there are confidence intervals. And so every one of you are probably saying, man, that's a huge confidence interval. And it is. I want to be very transparent that that's only 21 people in that group. And pretty amazing, in this large nationally representative study, that it's such a small number of people. Absolutely have to treat this as, proof of principle, early evidence, but also as a bellwether for needed future studies that actually can assess people, once they get to a phase like this. Here's the other look at the same frailty milestone data that I just described. And so age-adjusted survival curves, the top one is for those people who never developed any criteria. Upon passing one criteria, they go, in that monotone fashion as you continue down along the line. And so, once again, albeit with, admittedly small numbers, you can see the very noticeably different survival experience among those reaching 5 criteria. And so I have one more analysis, and then we'll summarize sort of this first point. This now is the time varying Cox model. And so this is where the number of criterion can go up and down in time. It's just, when you're at a certain state, what is your hazard going into the next period, basically. And so once again, you see a very similar thing with this sort of gradual increase, maybe a hint of, sort of a first increase of risk, sort of maybe another 2 to 3-fold risk at 3 and 4 criteria, and then maybe sort of another 3 to 4-fold risk going to 5 criteria. And these are fully adjusted for all of the covariates. And so I would say for this first part, in summary, there is evidence consistent with the hypothesis of the existence of a threshold leading to a critical transition. So we'll return to that at the end of the talk. Okay, let's go to these other 2 ways of looking at this question of frailty progression. And so I set up that one of them was the idea of catastrophic versus progressive onset. If you look at the far left, you see 3 categories of people here. There are individuals who never had onset of frailty, no incident frailty over the entire period in which they were observed in the NHATS study. So they could be pre-frail, but not frankly frail. Then there are 2 types of frail people who did have incident frailty, those for whom there was the onset of pre-frailty before frailty emerged, and those who went straight in the bottom row from being robust to being frail. So more of an all-at-once catastrophic onset. And so you can see both crude and adjusted hazard ratios for all-cause mortality here. This is going from the beginning of the study to, however long they were under observation. And so you can see the expected sort of increase in the mortality hazard for the different types of frailty onset. I would say, not as clear, or at least as evocative a threshold type of an association. And then finally, we also evaluated the rate of onset and actually the type of onset having to do with patterns of change in terms of whether an individual had a steady state of being having no frailty criteria, whether they did accrue frailty criteria, but in a strictly increasing way, so strictly progressive, if you will, or if they bounced up and down. If they did develop frailty criterion, but at some point they also lost frailty criteria. So this slide is just meant to clarify that concept. You can see, we're just counting the number of criteria here. Here's an individual who had what we would call a fluctuating pattern. They get a criterion, but then they lose it, right? And then whatever happens thereafter, they're already defined as a fluctuating person. On the other hand, if their pattern were like I just animated in, then their pattern of the accrual of criteria would be monotone, continually progressive. And so here's the analysis in terms of that lens on things. And so again, stable really is robust. People who, at least while under our observation, never accrued any frailty criteria, the fluctuating group and this monotone group. And so, interestingly, whether crudely or adjusted for all of the covariates, the fluctuating group was not at increased risk of mortality. It was just that monotone group that was at increased risk of mortality. And so it's really a lesson that the nature of the progression may really matter in terms of the subsequent mortality risk that an older adult has. Now, just one more look at progression. And here I'm going to a different study. This is a different study I was privileged to do with Damani Piggott and others in a study on AIDS. And so you can see it's the AIDS linked to the intravenous experience cohort, or a live study. So these are not all older adults, but they are middle-aged to older adults. We all know that older age is an increasingly important issue in HIV/AIDS. And so what Damani wanted to do was to consider subsequent periods of potential transition. And so what we did was to look at 2 periods preceding each origin for then considering subsequent mortality. And so then there are, if you just consider non-frail and frail as a binary thing, 4 different possibilities. You were either non-frail in both of those preceding periods, you went from frail to non-frail, you went from non-frail to frail, or you went from frail to frail. You were frail in both periods. And so from one point of view, the survival experience is exactly as you would predict. These are age-adjusted curves from a time-varying analytic setting. If you were non-frail to non-frail, of course, your experience is the best. If you were frail to frail, those individuals' experience is the worst. But it was sort of interesting, the way that these curves emerge. And so in the early part of the follow-up, meaning the first 4 years or so, the frail to frail, non-frail to frail groups are indistinguishable. So at some level, at least in this study, becoming frail had an equal risk associated with it than just being frail repeatedly. But eventually, the risk of those individuals is better, than the people who were frail on both occasions. And then there's another convergence. And so the green, where my cursor is frail to non-frail. So they begin better, right? They've improved, but by the end of the study, the risk for these individuals is the same as the non-frail to frail. And so I think that this has connections both to progressive versus monotone frailty accrual also to, thinking about the mechanism underlying mortality, whether the implications are for shorter term mortality or for longer term mortality. And the one other thing I can see at the bottom of the slide is that, I found one other paper that did almost exactly the same analysis that we did, and their curves looked exactly like this. So it was quite interesting to see quite how replicated the two studies are of each other. I'm just going to flash this. These are additional recent references on progression and mortality. I'll just leave it at that unless anyone wants to come back to it. Okay, so in my last remaining time, I do want to highlight 3 practical issues. When we think about, okay, there is an interesting, potentially very important association between not only frailty and all-cause mortality, but the manner in which frailty emerges, the stage where of potential underlying physiological progression, dysregulation progression that's indicated at a given point in physical frailty, particularly whether a critical transition is imminent or even has emerged. But once we have that information, what do we want to then do about it? And so one practical consideration is to be a little careful about this term of progression. And so this is a table straight out of the Chen-Li Xu paper that, I was privileged to be a part of, and I mostly covered in the last part of the talk, which is a transition table. And so on the rows, you can see previous visit status, let's say a year ago. And this is only among people who were frail at the previous visit, having either 3, 4, or 5 criteria. And so then we go to the next visit status, that's about a year later, and calculate probabilities of where these people ended up. So for example, death occurred for about 14% of those with 3 criteria, 11% of those with 4, and 38% of those with 5 criteria. So at one level, this is one more lens on that fairly dramatically increased risk at 5 criteria. What I really, though, wanted to point out is at the right of the slide, where you can see the column labeled as recovery. And so pretty astonishing numbers, actually. 54% of those with 3 or 4 criteria actually recovered to a non-frail state. So it could be pre-frail. It's rare, actually, to go all the way back to robust, but they recovered to a state less than what we would call, frankly, physically frail. Even among those with 5 criteria, more than a quarter recovered. And so this idea that at least I sometimes have, that frailty is relentlessly progressive, isn't borne out, at least by measures of the physical frailty phenotype. And this isn't a brand new finding. Many of you know that there are prior references going back all the way to 2006, where exactly the same phenomenon has been observed. And so I think this is something we need to better understand, what the mechanisms and prognostic factors might be. The role of simple measurement error doubtless has a part in this as well. Okay, second practical consideration has to do with what do we then intend to do, once we know about these interesting associations. Association really is a proof of principle for frailty as a potential target whereby to decrease mortality risk. So that's great, that's important. But I think sometimes we want to go a step farther and actually use frailty as a screening measure, to then do something about, or even for case finding, to develop a more specific intervention. And so if we're out to screen, we want to, cast a broad net and identify people potentially at risk. Well, then we need a measure with high sensitivity that with high probability identifies those truly at risk, even if it means that we get some false positives as well. And then for case finding, really depends on the nature of the resource planning or the intervention targeting that we intend to do, what properties it should have. And so specifically the sensitivity, specificity, true, false, positive, true, false, negative balance, really depends on the nature of how onerous or costly the intervention may be. In either case, the frailty measures that we typically use in practice have been shown not to be all that great in the context of screening and case finding. And I think Leo Rodriguez Mañez and his group have really done a lot of work on this. So I've pulled the table that you see from one of that group's papers, which was introducing the frailty trait scale. So on the left, you can see frailty trait scale. Physical phenotype is next, physical frailty at cutoffs of pre-frailty and then frailty, and then the deficit accumulation index at a cutoff of 0.275. And so next you can see the sensitivity, the specificity, the positive and negative predictive value. And I think that maybe the story is in the positive predictive value, that none of them do a very good job at it. Now, that might be fine for some uses, particularly screening. Less good the farther one gets through case finding to even diagnostic use. I can point out for the physical frailty phenotype, the sensitivity is rather low, and so one wouldn't necessarily want to use that particular cutoff for a screening purpose. And so just features to keep in mind when we move past scholarly work to implementation and practice. And then one other, I'm going to use a jargony term to be sort of cool and with it. Sorry, that just showed I'm not those terms, but algorithmic fairness, which it's a term I've only learned in the last year. But it relates to some work I've been doing for a few years now about physical frailty, which address the question of whether demographic subgroups with the same underlying frailty status manifest their frailty equivalently, in the case of this talk via the physical frailty phenotype. Those of you from a psychometric background, I'm talking about differential item functioning, or DIF. And so, I, some years ago, had begun examining racial differences in frailty in the National Health and Aging Trend Study once again. And, there sadly in the United States are stark disparities in frailty among older adults by racial groups. But as a student and I were trying to dig down further into this, we stumbled upon this troubling hint of differential measurement, by racial groups. And this is the NHATS measure. So I want to be very clear about that. It may not pertain to, the other realizations of physical frailty. But on the left, you can see the odds ratio for the increased prevalence, in this case, of physical frailty among non-Hispanic Black older adults as compared to non-Hispanic white older adults in the United States. And so it's a pretty severe increase. This is after adjusting for many, many things. What follows then is just an example of two of the five individual frailty criteria, and so really take a look at exhaustion. So even though Black older adults have a considerably higher odds of having frailty overall, they have a considerably lower odds of reporting exhaustion. And so that, for sure, it's differential measurement somehow. You just can't have that pattern without differential measurement. I see I'm running close to the end, so I'm not going to try to describe this slide in detail, other than to just say that, when we did a more formal latent variable-based analysis, there was basically one criterion that seemed solidly anchored between the two racial groups. Here you can see the same thing I pointed out a minute ago, but here we're really using latent variables, asking the question of differences in manifestation among people whose underlying frailty status is the same. And so then the final question is, does it matter, right? Does it matter? And so disturbing hints that it might, so on the left, you can see, again, in NHATs, by the number of frailty criteria, just all-cause mortality curves for Black older adults compared to white older adults on the right. And so the fact that the curves are more compressed together among the Black older adults indicates that frailty is not doing as good a job, at least the number of criteria is not doing as good a job at differentiating mortality risk for Black older adults as it is for white. And here's a sort of a lightly adjusted analysis that has a punchline to it, that the in the red towards the bottom, the association between frailty and mortality in Black older adults is weaker by 33%, 34% as compared to white older adults. I do want to hasten to say there are other things than algorithmic fairness or measurement differences that could explain this. I do not at all want to say, oh, it's got to be measurement. But the fact that there are measurement differences, I think, makes this something that we at least need to pursue further. And so I'm almost done. Just as a summary, for the main part of the talk, the findings were consistent with an etiological tipping point in the natural history of physical frailty progression, signaling a critical transition in the risk of all-cause mortality. And we're also indicative of progressively increasing risk before such a tipping point. And so, I think there's all sorts of implications of what to do about this. One other finding, though, is that we must be very wary of single point in time frailty assessments. That we saw many ways in which one really needs to study progression explicitly in order to characterize the mortality risk accurately and precisely, with the mode of emergence and the potential for remission both being highly relevant. Limitations in the study, for sure. Small number of individuals of 5 criteria. I think it's really hard to study those individuals. Probably those who participated, I would hypothesize they were the healthiest that they could be. But really an area where studying this important group is important. And then also, I think I just alluded in informative dropout, that lots of cases, I think the people who we don't see in the studies are the people whose frailty is affecting them the most severely. So creative designs to get around that are needed. And future priorities, for sure, studies to further evaluate the dynamical systems hypothesis. We are ourselves embarking on some of that work. I know others of you on the line surely are as well. Potential measurement improvements of various kinds, particularly in cases for screening, case finding, that sort of thing. Addressing the clinical implications of a tipping point. If you go and read the paper, I think Chen Li really led us in talking about palliative care and advanced planning and those sorts of things past a tipping point. And I can testify that I, wish that I had thought more about that. And then finally, the development of interventions to forestall progression past a critical transition. Brief acknowledgements. I want to acknowledge everybody who was on that paper. Chen Li, I've already credited. Jing Tan helped us with the analysis. Judy Casper, of course, and then Linda Freed, who of course is our longtime colleague and I think for many of us mentor. Also the Nature Aging paper that I alluded to, Alan Cohen and Jeremy Walston and Ravi Varadhan in combination with others who were on the first paper. And, all of these are dear colleagues, sometimes going back 30 years. And finally, the studies that contributed data, National Institute on Aging for funding for most of this work, and then our Older Americans Independent Center at Johns Hopkins. And so I believe I will end it there and welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Karen, for your excellent presentation. You actually explained very clearly some very complex concepts. So thank you so much for this. We already have several questions from our audience. You can see them also in the Q&A tab. The audience cannot see them, I think, so I will have to read them. So I'll start with the first. in motor control, the critical transition is called dynamic changes in motor control, except, for example, a horse falls in an individual speed from trot to gallop. Therefore, I wonder if dynamic changes instead of critical transition might not be a term understood by different professions.
I think this is a great point, that communication in science is such an important thing. We use different terms for different concepts. I would say that in this case, the term critical transition comes out of the dynamical systems literature. And sorry, I'm just realizing I have my plug here, but I didn't plug it in. There we go. I'm not going to die now. Okay. And so, but absolutely. So I think that term is important when there's a readership that is coming from a viewpoint of, dynamical system study as we think about it in engineering and mathematics. But absolutely ensuring that we're communicating to broader audiences. Thank you for that note.
Our next question, to assess the progression of physical frailty, how long would you think is sufficient enough as a follow-up period for elderly populations?
Well, that is a terrific question. So how long to assess the progression of physical frailty? And so I would say, based on the data that I've seen, you'll understand I'm not a clinician, and so I don't have the very important clinical, acumen to weigh in on this. But based on our data, I would say even a year's worth of progression advances very considerably over only one point in time. We saw that from the Damani-Piggott paper. I personally would recommend and hope that increasingly measures of frailty will be implemented in the electronic medical record. I know many of you have worked on that. We're working on that and have made some progress at Hopkins so that it becomes a part of a patient's record. And with data like those, we would be better able to answer your question.
Can interventions contribute to fluctuating and push a patient out of the monotone progression? Can we influence the patient's type of progression?
I certainly hope so, and I think that we do have some intervention research that has, demonstrated some hopeful signs, but certainly going all the way back to Bortz's paper in the 1990s about systemic underpinnings of physical frailty. A key hypothesis is that frailty is intervenable before threshold, right? So that's the other important element of thinking in terms of a potential critical transition. We would hypothesize that before that point, frailty absolutely is intervenable. We would hypothesize that interventions having to do with increasing the fitness of stress response systems would be ones that physically stand to be effective, potentially also psychosocial interventions. I really don't want to lose track of that, even though we study mostly physical frailty. So anyway, it's sort of a long-winded way of saying yes, but it's a critical area of study to think about how to forestall frailty and not only how to use frailty to guide other clinical care.
Great one. With regard to the table showing that physical frailty might not be progressive, did you look by chance at resilience or reserve capacity in these people, which might explain the reduction in physical frailty?
The answer is no, but interestingly, we do have some data that we're accruing by which we may be able to do this. And so very briefly in the introduction, you heard Olga refer to the SPRING study. And so that is flat out a study of physical resilience in which we are probing using dynamical tests the systems that we hypothesize to underlie both resilience and frailty. So thank you for that excellent question. It is something that I would hope we would be able to probe there.
Next question. How do you explain such a difference in survival analysis between white and Black older adults? Do you think that social factors should be considered in the evaluation of the frailty or access to healthcare?
Absolutely. Oh, without a question. So in the context of the United States, absolutely, socioeconomic deprivation, access to healthcare, racism. We did some analyses that actually, indicated that at least proportionately, the disparity among white and Black older adults in the highest income quartile was at least as large as it was in the lowest income quartile. So yeah, both of them better off because they have higher income, but the proportionate difference was at least as large. So yes, I believe that's a critically important area, and I'm privileged to be involved in some work trying to address those questions.
The impact on mortality of going from robust to frail was very interesting. Was there some precipitating event in the interim? Example, fracture, MI, stroke, pneumonia, etc.?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And so we did not elucidate that in the paper, but it would be, I think, of insightful refinement to do. I think without doubt, yes, for some of those people, based on just exploration of other data sets in the past. And so absolutely, but we did not study it in detail in this paper or in this associated work.
Thoughts on use of self-report frailty measures in routine clinical practice versus measuring grip strength, gait speed, etc. In my experience, asking clinicians to measure frailty seems to be unrealistic.
Yeah, I agree that I've heard that, and I admit that as just a statistician and not a clinician, I always sort of grate against it. It's like, what's so hard? But I do appreciate that the clinical setting can be frenetic, and that every moment is precious. And so, I do still think that there are versions of frailty assessments that incorporate performance-based measures that are not horribly onerous, particularly if one is willing to introduce a little measurement error. By the same token, there are some settings where we know that's flat out impossible, right? If there's an urgent health issue, you're just not going to get somebody to do a performance-based measure. And so we know that the crosswalk, and Olga, I think you've done some really interesting work on this, the crosswalk between self-reported and performance-based frailty measures is not very good. In terms of, the concordance is not great, the cross validity is not great. And so it's an area if we are going to move to self-report, where much better measures than just pulling off the shelf, oh, I'm going to use disability, as a proxy for gait speed really are needed.
You mentioned that physical frailty might not be the most sensitive for detecting frailty. Are there other indicators from a functional perspective that are better predictors, like for instance, sensory impairment?
Absolutely. So I guess I'll answer that in two different ways that come quickly to mind. One is that if you just limit your attention to the physical frailty phenotype criteria, the cutoff of 3 out of 5, or using those criteria in terms of I'm only going to categorize non-pre-frail and frail may not at all be optimal for screening or case finding or those sorts of purposes. And so, one could imagine other ways of using those data that could yield to a more sensitive or specific measure. But yes, I've often felt that, at least for some screening, case finding, diagnostic purposes, it's a mistake to just rely on frailty as if it is going to, serve as the be all for identifying individuals highly at risk with sufficient sensitivity or specificity, and that we should be thinking in terms of incorporating a feasible, minimal, but potentially important set of other indicators into those risk prediction algorithms. And sensory impairment might be a very good one to consider.
If I can add a question about, you touched on it a little bit, but what can we learn from the population studies that we already used to examine frailty, assuming that many of them were not designed to measure frailty? So we used a lot of aging studies to assess frailty. And you touched on very many times the highest levels of frailty, we only see them in a very small population, which might not be representative of our population and our communities, but it is what it is in the studies. Or the idea of we assess frailty once and then we try to predict outcomes 10, 20 years later. What suggestions would you have for future study design?
Yeah, I've often felt that we need auxiliary data, much more auxiliary data than these studies tend to obtain. And so, you know, two forms of that could either be a real focus on home interviews. So many of these studies, people had to come into a clinic, and after a certain point, that's just not going to happen. But you might be able to retain them longer if one is willing to go and do assessments at the home. And we did that with the Women's Health and Aging Study 1, and that was actually very successful. The other form is what I call the foot in the door questionnaire. And so this is the idea: you reach out to somebody to come back to your study and they're like, no, I'm just not doing it. Do not darken my door again. You might be able to say, absolutely, I won't darken your door again. But before you go, you know, could I just ask you, you know, this very, very short assessment, you know, which might be frailty, right? Or might be, you know, just so that we have an insight into those people who are dropping out that's better than nothing.
Thank you so much, Karen. And so we're running out of time. So I would like to thank you for your presentation, and also I'd like to thank the audience for the questions. As we mentioned at the beginning, after the end of your presentation, you will receive the certificate for completion and also a short survey about today's presentation. Please fill out the survey, and also don't forget to register for our next session that will be held on March 9th. Dr. Miquel Izquierdo from the Public University of Navarra in Spain will present on VivaFrail, exercise for older adults with frailty. On behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to thank our presenter for doing an excellent job, and also would like to thank everyone for attending our seminar series. Stay healthy and safe. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.